why don't you punish the United States, boycotting, divesting, and sanctions against the US, just as we do with Israel to make it weaker for the enormous damage that Donald Trump is doing now? And those are the sorts of ideas I'm hearing, and I'm hearing it from Nairobi-based Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, calling for worldwide sanctions against Donald Trump on the climate walkout. The BRICS didn't do anything to change a global division of labor and the multilateral institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. And they're taking the resources out. So the BRICS are the new middlemen in the process. And do we need an alternative? Yes.
This is Professor Patrick Bond. He is a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Johannesburg, the director for social change. He is an author and critic of neoliberalism, colonization, BRICS, climate justice. His recent academic works are on BRICS chaos, the fountain mine disaster, as well as US-South Africa political tension. Professor Patrick Bond has agreed to sit with us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion to discuss Africa-BRICS relations, a multipolar myth in new globalization. Prof, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion. For a start, you've been a fierce advocate against globalization, where you said African nations often export their wealth and import poverty. Where do you think BRICS as an economic bloc claiming to challenge Western-led hegemony fit within this dynamic? Is it a disruptor or a perpetuator of unequal globalization against the African continent?
Mohammed, thanks for having me on your show. It's a very, very important platform, especially because we really do have a problem on the continent where there's certainly a myth that especially the major forces from the new BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus new members, including this year, Indonesia, and last year, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, with Saudi Arabia being invited but not really saying yes or no. So we have 10 official BRICS, and now there are another several partners. One of them, Nigeria, has joined. Uganda has joined as a partner, second-class status, not yet a full member. Algeria is thinking about it. Turkey is thinking about it. Vietnam is thinking about it. Countries like Cuba and Bolivia on the left of the political spectrum have just become members, but more authoritarian regimes in Central Asia, like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Belarus, are also members, as well as Thailand in Southeast Asia and Malaysia. So we're looking at a very mixed bag of countries without the kind of, let's say, coherence that the 5 original BRICS had. And unfortunately, those 5 BRICS didn't do anything to regulate how they deal with Africa. They left it to South Africa. And I must say, sitting in Johannesburg, our elites who run the BRICS and our ruling economic elites, they didn't have any interest in changing the existing neo-colonial relationship in which Western companies, Western states, and multilateral institutions controlled by the West, but now with BRICS as partners, where they just loot the continent. And the looting is typically to draw out raw materials, but not pay sufficiently, the term that we use, unequal ecological exchange, as well as to take exploited workers' labor, even child labor, when we look at things like my cell phone, and it has in it the Eastern DRC mines, particularly mines where Chinese companies are taking child labor or no trade union labor or worker safety and health deficient labor operations in the mines, with ecological devastation, including depletion of the wealth, sending that often through Rwanda illegally to China, where exploited Chinese workers are putting together the final product. And the Chinese get very little of that, and the Congolese get practically none. The real profits still go to Cupertino, California, the Apple headquarters, or Tesla, where South African-born Elon Musk uses some of the lithium and cobalt that comes from Africa, as well as companies even in South Korea, Western companies like Samsung. So what I'm driving at is that the BRICS didn't do anything to change a global division of labor and the multilateral institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. I'll even go so far as to say, Mohammed, that the BRICS have amplified these problems. They haven't actually acted as an alternative to Western imperialism. Instead, they're a sub-imperial ally of the West when it comes to looting the African continent.
Thank you very much for that explanation, Prof. Prof, in your recent article, you call BRICS as a multipolar myth. Will you unpack that for us?
Yes, Mohammed, there are really three positions, aren't there? There's the unipolar Western-centric system. Now, Donald Trump is making that a confused ideology and positionality. In other words, what's happening with the United States government is a fracturing in which Europe and the US are now heading in different directions in some very important multilateral management. But I think we can still say that Western power over the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, maybe for Africa most critically, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it's disastrous. So that's meant the second position has emerged over the past 15 years, a position that says, since the West isn't doing a very good job and the US has abused its hegemonic power, for example, its US dollar power to print US dollars, and since the West doesn't seem to have an ideological orientation to treat Africa and Africans fairly and with dignity, we therefore need a multipolar world, one in which we have a spreading out of power structures and new institutions, such as the BRICS New Development Bank. It was another institution, the BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement, meant to serve as an alternative to the International Monetary Fund. It was meant to be a BRICS credit rating agency, a BRICS alternative internet, many other institutions that the BRICS have talked about. In the case of the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, they even set it up, but they don't operate. So the BRICS New Development Bank, we can see, operates exactly as a World Bank, but even worse, with more corruption and more ecological destruction. And I think that means our multipolarism tends to be a myth. And when it turns out that the multipolar forces, the BRICS, they try to go into the multilateral institutions, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, they don't make them any better. We could talk about the Nigerian former finance minister who was so brutal, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, now becoming head of the WTO and not helping to overcome COVID-19 vaccine apartheid. In other words, not disrupting the power of Western intellectual property over those COVID vaccines. It's just one example. But when I look at what the BRICS have done, Nigeria now being a partner of the BRICS, but the India, for example, having the World Bank president named AJ Banga. But as we've seen from his work here in Johannesburg, the only way to describe him is as a predatory financier. And we look at what these multipolar advocates do in the IMF and World Bank, and their officials there, like AJ Banga, are just as bad. Moreover, when they changed the voting relationships, because China, Brazil, India, and Russia had a lot more money in 2015, they put it into the IMF. They increased their voting share, but the voting share of many African and Latin American and Asian countries went way down. Venezuela losing 41%, Nigeria 41%, South Africa losing 21%. In other words, the injustices of the existing global capitalist system are not being offset by a different set of multipolar advocates with different values. Really, instead, these BRICS elites are trying to scramble their way into the existing system to get a seat at the table. But as they climb up to get there, their feet are stomping down on African countries who get less of a voting share as a result. Now, that's the broad way in which the multipolar system is a myth, because we're not seeing a diffusion of power in an appropriate way for managing the poly-crisis, all of the problems like the climate catastrophe, because the BRICS and the G7, the rich countries, always cohere together. And we see that, the so-called multipolar power of South Africa as the host of the G20. But even when Donald Trump is walking out in the last 3 weeks, his foreign minister, Marco Rubio, his finance minister, Scott Bessent, didn't even come to the preliminary ministerial meetings here in South Africa. They're disgusted, they say, with the words solidarity, equality, and sustainability, the three words that are the themes of South Africa's hosting of the G20 this year, which means the multipolar challenge to the West isn't going anywhere. And instead of fighting, maybe even kicking out the United States from the G20 to make it a G19, since the US has walked out of the climate summit and World Health Organization is creating massive chaos in the tariff wars that it's engaged in, even with its friends in Europe, as well as China and, of course, its neighbors. It's threatening to invade Greenland and the Panama Canal. No space for the US in a civilized institution that can do multilateral reforms with multipolar power. But our South African government is too weak and, let's say, ideologically unclear as to make the decision. Let's push the US out before they host the G20 next year, which brings us to the third, which is the non-polar, that is a G20 from below, or BRICS from below, or G7 from below, where we see social movements finding ways to link. And the two most important non-polar ways of operating, I would say, are in climate justice advocacy, so that we have movements all across the world, including our G20 countries, including Nigeria, demanding climate justice and putting pressure on their governments and their corporates. The second is the solidarity with Palestine. It's really the big movement of the world, isn't it? And the repression that you would see in a place like Germany or the United States, getting worse all the time, hasn't really set back our movement. It's made everyone much clearer that any talk that you might hear from first Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and now Donald Trump and Marco Rubio, any talk about promoting Middle East, West Asian security and justice and two-state solution is nonsense. And any talk that they have liberal democracy in the likes of the United States and Germany is clearly a false assertion, given the repression of our allies in the Palestine solidarity movement. Those two movements really, I think, are the kind of, let's say, G20 from below that we want to be promoting as much as we can.
Prof, you, in your work, Sub-Imperialism as a Lubricant for Neoliberalism, you describe South Africa as a deputy sheriff within BRICS. I would like to understand, with China's debt trap diplomacy in Zambia and debt trap diplomacy as well as in Nigeria, where Chinese debt to Nigeria is being collateralized by the Nigerian oil, as well as the debt in Zambia is also collateralized by the Zambian resources, and Russian missionaries activities happening across the African sub-region. Do you think, is it merely replicating Western extractivism under multipolar facade?
Yes, absolutely. Now, each of these cases need individual analyses, and I wouldn't really use debt trap diplomacy. I mean, that in a way is what the West has always done, to put especially the post-colonial countries so deep in debt that the IMF and the World Bank can run their capital cities from, a cubicle in 18th and H Streets, Northwest Washington, D.C. That's the power of the multilaterals. And I wish the BRICS would challenge them. They don't. They're really part of it. And that means if China has large debts that it made for Chinese built infrastructure for profits for not only the construction companies, but then the extractive industries, because a great deal of this infrastructure is for the power plants that can fuel the smelting and the deep mining, or the roads and bridges, the infrastructure that takes the minerals or the cash crops out of Africa to China. It's exactly the same way that the colonial powers in 1885 in Berlin divided and conquered the continent just in order to get at what is useful from Africa. There's no real difference, except that to some extent, the Chinese are a little less politically, let's say, arrogant as the West. The Chinese will support dictators. We've seen that in places like Zimbabwe, but when Robert Mugabe suddenly realizes that his diamonds have been looted by the Chinese, as Mugabe put it, we had $17 billion of diamonds, or we had 15 billion and only had $2 billion in revenues to show for it. And then there was a coup, and the Chinese were very happy to see his replacement, Emerson Mnangagwa, come right in with the army, something that they had approved through the major figure in the army just before in 2017 when he visited China. Those are the sorts of, let's say, hypocrisies. Here in South Africa, the Chinese embassy has said, we will not allow South Africa to have the Dalai Lama to come and visit. So there is a bit of a myth that the Chinese are politically less, let's say, abusive compared to the West. What's really crucial, though, is that these relationships in a global value chain, such as the looting of so many minerals that are going to be crucial for the rare earths and for other crucial minerals in energy transitions. These are now being very, very much carried out by the likes of BRICS companies. And it's not only the Chinese. South Africa has many companies that have operated up and down the east side of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And over the last year, the army from South Africa was deployed there. And the sense we have in South Africa is it's a terrible waste of money. The loss of life of South African troops, a couple of dozen over the past year, is also reflected in South African troops' deployment in northern Mozambique, which was mainly to defend Total Energy's huge oil investment, and ExxonMobil from the US with China National Petroleum, British Petroleum, and the Italian firm Eni. Now, these are the sorts of relationships where there's a lot of self-interest, and we've seen that with two other BRICS countries. We've seen it with the Russian, especially West African relationships with the Wagner Group, now called the Africa Corps, after their leader was assassinated, probably by Vladimir Putin in the middle of 2023, but also the United Arab Emirates, and they're playing terrible games in the Sudanese, in a sense, war between two parts of the army. Likewise, the Indian companies, especially ones like ArcelorMittal, Lakshmi Mittal, an Indian who's located in Luxembourg, or Vedanta, led by Anil Agarwal, also located in Luxembourg. But these are Indian companies, and they're looting unbelievably intensely in places like South Africa, and then milking our steel industry and closing it down because of cheap Chinese imports. So it's an all-around disaster when we think about the economic relationships that have stemmed from BRICS, because the deindustrialization of South Africa, of Zimbabwe, of Zambia, many countries that had Nigeria, they had very strong, like we had 24% manufacturing to GDP at the time of early 1990s. And then came globalization and especially very inexpensive East Asian imports, now mostly Chinese, that destroyed the clothing, the textile, the appliances, the footwear, the electronics industry. So we're down from 24% manufacturing to GDP down to 12%. So these are some of the problems that you could say reflect the penetration of a more aggressive extractive industries, more aggressive trade that deindustrializes. And then the finance is really on top of that, because Chinese finance, about 18%. It's not the majority of finance, but it's a huge amount. And it is, as you say, sometimes linked to, let's say, the collateralization. And we saw that in a very dramatic way in Sri Lanka, where a huge port had to be handed over to the Chinese to run. And these are the sorts of things I think Africans who are, in a way, caught up in trying to be within globalization, and they hope the Chinese or Indians or even South Africans will offer them better deals. They better think twice and look hard at the devil in the details.
I want to ask you about the New Development Bank. It claims to offer an alternative to IMF. Do you think, is it really offering that to African countries?
Well, it's really important to look at this New Development Bank, because it's really only made loans here in South Africa and in Lesotho, and it might start making loans in Egypt, which is a member. But we haven't seen the rest of Africa, including one of the BRICS 10 members, Ethiopia, because Ethiopia defaulted just days before joining the BRICS. It couldn't pay its foreign loans. So it's not a reliable borrower for the BRICS New Development Bank, and I predict it won't be involved as a member as a result. We might even say the same about over-indebted countries, Nigeria being one. But South Africa has taken a lot of loans. Some of them are loans for COVID-19, which carried the sort of conditionalities to cut the budget that today, as our budget is announced, we'll see vast amounts going to repaying debt and major cuts in healthcare and education. And my students at University of Johannesburg literally go hungry because of those budget cuts. We chip in as faculty members to the food bank. Now, these are the kinds of things that everyone in Africa should have warned our elites in South Africa about. Don't go to the IMF or its new junior partner, the BRICS New Development Bank. And the BRICS Bank does some general loans, like the COVID loans, but it also does project loans. And if we look at those, which I've done in detail, about a dozen major project loans, they're so full of corruption and ineffective and ecologically catastrophic activities that I don't see any difference between the BRICS New Development Bank and the World Bank, with the one exception that over decades there have been struggles from Africa, from all over the world, against the World Bank. So we have systems in place like there are complaints mechanisms, there are oversight bodies, there's international media. And the fact that the BRICS New Development Bank, even though it's run by a wonderful woman whose name is Dilma Rousseff, she was president of Brazil. And I know from having talked to her for several days during a conference in 2019 that her value system doesn't reflect this IMF World Bank. However, because she's president of the BRICS New Development Bank, frankly, she has to play by these global financial rules. And just one example of that shows you the contradictions and the irrationality and the incoherence of the BRICS is that on March 4, 2022, a week after this illegal invasion by Vladimir Putin's army into the Ukrainian east, having already in 2014 taken over illegally the Crimea. So the Russian army comes into the east, and then it starts coming from the north, from Belarus, marching towards Kiev, the capital. And at that point, as the world could see, well, this is really a takeover, a military takeover of a neighbor. One of the strategies was to freeze the Russian assets around the world that they had carelessly left from the central bank, over $300 billion in Western institutions. But in addition, to commit no more lending and no more involvement of the Russian economy in the US dollar-denominated trading system based in Belgium. It's called SWIFT. It makes it hard without that to have relationships. Now, ironically, on March 4, just as this was happening, the BRICS New Development Bank, which was 20% owned, right? 1 in 5 of those original BRICS own the BRICS New Development Bank. A 20% member, Moscow, was itself cut out in the same way as if it were a Western bank. The reason for that's very revealing. Having talked to one of the top managers of the BRICS New Development Bank, it was very clear that the real bosses of the BRICS Bank are not the leaders in the capitals of the BRICS countries. It's 3 credit rating agencies in New York City, and you know their names. They're Standard & Poor's, Fitch, Moody's, and just like they rate everyone, every country, governments, but also big companies, they would say, well, we're going to give the BRICS New Development Bank a lower rating because you have so much Russian debt in your portfolio. And it's that contradiction that these BRICS are trying to play within Western finance. Most of the BRICS New Development Bank loans, 73%, are in fact 77% today, although it should be going down to 70% by 2030. But they're denominated in dollars or euros. They're not denominated in local currencies, BRICS currencies. And that to me is another reflection that the people we see running the BRICS are really just a lower grade version of the Western-oriented bourgeoisies of these different countries and of the world. And they really see themselves as part of a transnational capitalist class. And they're just as happy sitting in the World Bank and IMF and the different committee meetings as they are going out to see their own citizens who are suffering massively. To me, this is why we really cannot trust the BRICS elites, much as you would not trust Western elites.
If you want to see us in quality studio, if you want to see quality equipment in our studio, I encourage you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel, like, comment, share, as well as recommend this podcast to your friends and family members to be subscribers. Prof, I want to understand African Continental Free Trade Area aimed to boost inter-African trade by 450 million. Do you think BRICS have any mechanism to support this vision, or are they just extracting raw materials from African countries, thereby undermining our industrialization process?
I fear you're right in asking whether the BRICS are going to sabotage the ideal of an Africa without borders so that we can have more efficient economic systems. We're not divided into 54 different operating entities with borders that include customs and excise duties. But right now, the elites in most of Africa don't want to lose those customs and excise duties. So you see they're moving very, very slowly towards the African free trade common area. And one of the reasons is also the lack of a financing operation. And I must say that South Africa has played a very detrimental role in refusing. And we have very big banks here. One of them, Standard Bank, is all over Africa. And these banks probably don't have any particular interest in seeing alternatives to US dollar-based financing. That's what they trust. So South Africa is not doing its part to set up financing mechanisms to get over those barriers at each border where you have to say, well, this is worth so and so many kwacha, this is worth a Zim gold, sort of currency, or you look at the Pula in Botswana, and all of these. Although we have our own Southern African Customs Union where you can rationalize the different currencies. For the rest of Africa, I fear that really the BRICS have got relationships, just as the West do, that depend upon the US dollar for trading as a sound mechanism. And even though there's rhetoric, Mohammed, about the de-dollarization, that it would allow local currencies to be used in trade, with terrible trade imbalances. And in much of Africa, we are sending goods to China, but we're also importing manufactured goods, just as the old neo-colonial relationship defined it. And unfortunately, we're not seeing the Chinese yuan, the renminbi, open up as a relatively convertible currency. They have very strong exchange controls. The same for the Indian rupee. So we're not seeing yet, it might change, we're not seeing a commitment by the elites of BRICS to really break through the barriers, especially finance for trade. But also, I would say African elites should take some blame, particularly South Africa, because we do get such a large share of revenues in many African countries from the import duties, the customs and excise duties. And we're going to start seeing in the trade wars, especially the United States, as it drops its Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, instead of having much more exporting to the United States, because the tariffs are lower for African goods. For South Africa, big companies like BHP Billiton for aluminium, ArcelorMittal for steel, Sasol for petrochemicals, Mercedes, BMW, VW, Toyota for cars, and those are the bulk, along with some vineyards and some agriculture, corporate agriculture. Those are the bulk of beneficiaries. And there's such a good debate going on here about how do you handle the United States if it's going to cut off AGOA. South Africa will certainly be thrown out. And my prediction, given what Donald Trump is doing with tariffs, is going to end AGOA at the first opportunity, this Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And that, I think, will force African countries to say, well, we don't have this export benefit that we used to. Therefore, the demand from the United States will decline. And therefore, maybe we should reorient our economies to the African continent and have more coherent relationships and not just continue, each one of us, doing exports of cash crops, minerals, and fossil fuels. Instead, let's get some coherence. So that's our vision. That's the hope I think everyone on the continent has. But to get over these elites who play games with trade and finance, it's going to be a big challenge. I think, like we saw maybe in Senegal, or we've seen attempted in Kenya, to throw out bad governments. The Ruto government was the target of the Gen Z last year. In Mozambique, as we speak, there's continuing unrest and desire to throw out the corrupted Frelimo government. Lots of debates in South Africa about throwing out our corrupted government. Well, I think that process has to continue and will probably get more intense the more we go into a world recession and these conditions of ordinary people get more desperate, the more their budgets are cut, as we're going to see here in South Africa today.
As President Trump's continue to withdraw U.S. from major institutions, like you initially stated, do you think BRICS have the capacity to fill in the gaps that will be left behind by the United States, or that's been left behind by the United States?
Mohammed, let's look at a couple of the examples, like the World Health Organization, which the U.S. is defunding. It won't be the BRICS that make up the gap. Unfortunately, one of the richest men in the world, Bill Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have already made the WHO, our World Health Organization, a sort of experimental lab, and they want to play their own games and try all sorts of, different things with the WHO. And we got an example of the WHO failing us during COVID because there were two major countries providing vaccines, not just the Western, particularly US, German, British, Norwegian, and Swiss. So those were some of the countries, the French as well, were providing vaccines. We also had China and Russia. You remember the Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines. And we also had Russia's Sputnik vaccine. Now, those vaccines should have gone to the WHO, and a coherent strategy for distributing them across the world in view of the fact that the Western regimes, especially Angela Merkel in Germany and Boris Johnson in the UK, they refused to waive the intellectual property to make it possible to produce all of these vaccines with generic production facilities in Lagos or in Harare or in Johannesburg. Instead, we had to import the expensive vaccines from the Western producers. But the Chinese and the Russian producers didn't change that. They didn't join the leaders of India and South Africa, Narendra Modi and Cyril Ramaphosa, in the World Trade Organization to get rid of those. And they set up a very dubious scheme in the World Health Organization, which the North benefited from more than the South. And it's in those respects that the multilateral system, again and again, especially in an emergency where you need a global public good, you need everyone in the world to work together to get rid of vaccine apartheid. And then we see the material interests of big companies, particularly from the West, the big private corporates, but also from China and Russia. A second example is in the climate negotiations. Yes, the US has also walked out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Well, we knew they were going to. That's what Donald Trump campaigned on. But also we knew that they'd done it before in 2017. So I would always ask anyone, including the African group of negotiators, for example, Ali Mohammed from Kenya, who was running the AGN last year in Baku, why don't you punish the United States? They should be thrown out. Well, they've walked out, but they should be given major punishments like tariffs on any goods and services that are sold from the United States anywhere in the world. There should be a global move to say to those countries as irresponsible, as climate denialist as the United States, now you're walking out, you're not going to pay loss and damage. That is, you're rejecting polluter pays, which is a standard logic of environmental management. If you make a mess, you pay to clean it up, not the victims who've been messed on. And Africa has so many cases where disasters have happened. Here in South Africa, 500 people killed in one day, April 12th, 2022, because of a rain bomb. That is 350 millimeters of rain hit in Durban, the third largest city, killing 500, doing billions of dollars of damage. And you never see the United States saying, yeah, we polluted more than anyone else. We should pay. So as a result, we need to start finding creative means of punishment. The most creative actually is interesting. It's to tackle a Johannesburg taught, he was at high school, Pretoria-born tycoon, the richest man in the world, who happens to be the man Donald Trump has chosen to chop through the US bureaucracy, withdrawing aid, including the vitally needed PEPFAR, Presidential Executive Program for AIDS Relief. PEPFAR is keeping millions of Africans alive. Here in this country, we have about 7 million people who are living with HIV, and many of them do get their medicines, their antiretrovirals, from the public health. And the US has just chopped 20% of our budget for it. So these are the ways in which I think we're going to have to start to say it's time for the US to pay some penalty. And what Elon Musk, the major figure in the Trump regime, who was born in South Africa and raised to some extent, he was bullied by kids at the school, Bryanston High School, where normally those rich kids are meant to learn the habits of white South Africa, running the apartheid system in the late 1980s when Elon Musk was there, running the most corrupt corporate city in the world, according to PwC, Johannesburg. And it's in that sense we feel very guilty, Mohammed. I mean, I think Johannesburg has given you Trevor Noah and Tyler, great singer, and Charlize Theron, the great actress. But we still have to apologize and make up for having given you Elon Musk. And so what's happening around the world is that his car company, Tesla, is crashing. It was valued about $1.3 trillion when Trump took over. It's now down to $900 billion and falling. People are setting fire to these cars. They're dumping them. They're rejecting them. Likewise, X, which was Twitter, that Elon Musk bought for $44 billion. People are walking out of that one. And likewise, his Starlink, which I hope African countries are careful about. Many African countries, even a country like Zimbabwe, uses Starlink. But you should know that Elon Musk abuses your data. So I wouldn't trust my internet link to you today, Mohammed, if it were going up into the satellite system of SpaceX called Starlink. And I think we all have to say, okay, what are the things that we can do even individually? And it means, I think, boycotting, divesting, and sanctions against the US, just as we do with Israel to make it weaker so that it isn't committing the genocide against Palestine. Those are the sorts of ideas I'm hearing. And I'm hearing it from Nairobi-based Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, calling for worldwide sanctions against Donald Trump on the climate walkout. I'm hearing it from the South African Federation of Trade Unions, our second major trade union federation here in South Africa, calling for BDS USA. Really, it's time, I think, for Africans especially to think, is Donald Trump and his sidekick, Elon Musk, going to do us so much damage that we better actually start to de-link from the US and think about not just AGOA ending, but maybe we need sanctions and tariffs against the US for the enormous damage that Donald Trump is doing now.
I want us to talk about the African youth. You know, the African youth unemployment exceeds more than 40%. And BRICS, as an economic institution, is investing in extractive industry in African countries, not in education, especially in science and technology. Do you think this is a deliberate attempt by BRICS to suppress what you have termed as demographic dividends for African countries? And how can BRICS invest in digital education to harness the potential of the African youth, whom are the future of the African continent?
Let's think, Mohammed, about what some of that, let's say, digital investment looks like. I mean, if it comes from the West, you know that we get addicted into some of these, let's say, social media apps whose objective is simply to draw us in deeper and waste our time. And it's actually similar if it's a TikTok, which operates in the West and is a Chinese company, but it's probably not going to remain Chinese. They're going to be forced to sell to a Western company. But it's also companies in China. And the two big ones, Tencent and Alibaba, are not much different. And what you see them doing with the Chinese government is participating in a surveillance of the people. And I do worry that Africa will get sucked into a fourth industrial revolution without adequate defense mechanisms. However, what I'm very convinced of, seeing what's just been happening in Mozambique with the movements for a fair election, and in Nigeria in the Days of Rage that occurred last August, and in the Gen Z in Kenya, I see the youth, the young lions of the continent, beginning to roar. Are they doing so in a coherent and ideologically clear way? Yes, to some extent, and in other places, well, still coming. The most impressive, I think, was Kenya, where not only was their dictatorial leader, William Ruto, his police shot 44 dead on just one day of protest, June 25, 2024. And the pressure was so much that Ruto had to get rid of his cabinet, and they shook up the parliament. That work is still in process to really make Kenya a democratic country. But what they also realized is that the big problem behind Kenya with the fiscal oppression, that is, they put on lots of new taxes in Kenya, which sparked the Gen Z to protest. That pressure came from the International Monetary Fund. So what was crucial, which our country here, South Africa, is also beginning to learn, is that you can't just stop with your own leader. You really have to deal with this IMF. And what the Gen Z protesters did, just 2 days after storming the parliament, then they went to the IMF and the World Bank. And that was part of their ideology to say, we want economic justice. I think what it means, and they called for this, a debt audit. And I hope all African youth say, what were our parents up to? What was the older generation doing by putting us, the next generation, into debt, by taking away the next generation's share of our natural resource wealth, our non-renewable minerals and fossil fuels? Why do the older generations burn the hydrocarbons in our coal in South Africa, our oil and gas, instead of leaving them for our generation and our children's, who can use the fossil fuels not to burn? That would be ridiculous because of the climate crisis and because Africa has good potential for renewable energy. Instead, we need to keep the fossil fuels underground because we would use the hydrocarbons for lubricants or plastics or other synthetic materials, for pharmaceutical products, for tarmac. If we can get a youth interest in the rights of future generations to add to the ideology which says, out with the old corrupt guys. Then we'll really be leading the world. And I'm hoping the young lions of Africa, as they go and protest and realize that their conditions are based on the underdevelopment, not only because of bad leaders or the IMF putting them in debt, Chinese debt on top of it, but it's also the whole economic model based on extracting non-renewable resources, which is our own economic sovereignty, right? That's where I'm hoping the ideological maturing of the youth goes, just the way it did at the time of independence, when throwing out the colonizers gave that space initially for the post-colonial governments to actually try to figure out how to use natural resources. And in some cases, they did so before the debt crises of the high interest rates of the 1980s hit. The commodity prices fell, and Africa, like today, fell into a debt trap. And because repaying debt is a generational injustice, the biggest question for Africa is, why were the odious debts, that's a technical term, odious means it shouldn't have been made, it's terrible, that a loan was made, often for a corrupt project. And we'll all ask, if we do a debt audit and we can find out who are we owing money to, it's legitimate. And when you ask that question, then the IMF and World Bank run in the other direction as fast as they can. They know they've been part of extremely corrupt indebtedness. And then you look at the US Federal Reserve, who've put the interest rates up since 2022, leaving Ghana and Zambia and Ethiopia to go into a default because they couldn't pay their debt. And then you sort of say, well, maybe it is time for Africa to find an alternative to that US dollar, which gives the US such power over interest rates and printing money, quantitative easing one day and putting on these extreme austerity measures the next. I hope that's the ideology that links the political economy in which Africa gets exploited and now needs to fight back, the political ecology in which our resources are drained, often now by the BRICS countries, but the final product, like my cell phone, is in the West. And thirdly, the social mobilization, that is how we get people together so that the alliances, like in Kenya, which, used to be full of ethnic divisions or political party alliances, and you see Gen Z sweeping out political parties of all sorts and really saying this is the youth's time. That's what we need, isn't it?
Thank you very much. When it comes to Gen Z protests, it's been highly praised by almost many youth organizations across the African continent. And an example of that was replicated in Ghana, where you had the Fix Their Country protest. And I spoke to some of the young people from Kenya as well. They said that they were being inspired by the protest that was held in Nigeria. I think somewhere around 2018, NSAS protest. So some of them said that they were inspired by that. And we also saw protests in like places like Liberia, where they talk about fix our country or free the citizens. All of those protests are happening across the African continent. But yet we're seeing that things are not changing the way we expect them to change. But I think the young people will continue to put pressure, exert more pressure on the governments to ensure that we have governments in place or systems in place that will lead to further development of our continent. I want us to go to another aspect of the discussion, which is the alternative to BRICS. Do you think African countries or the African Union can provide an alternative to BRICS?
Well, yes, let's say that we need to talk about BRICS as being part of a global division of labor in which now you have extractive industries, especially from China, but also India, Brazil, South Africa, here in Johannesburg, Russia, and they're taking the resources out. So the BRICS are the new middlemen in the process. And do we need an alternative? Yes. And will it come from the West? Pretty obviously not. The United Kingdom has just dropped its aid. Germany is spending more on arms. We know the US is utterly unreliable and people depending on PEPFAR are dying. So we can't really count on the West. And the BRICS are more exploitative. So is there an alternative? Now, we saw, especially where African countries have been divided and conquered on the question of supporting Israel, because Israel has bribed many countries. I mean, I'll name some like Morocco or Uganda or recently Zimbabwe. And so we're looking in a way to figure out how we can get a collective reply. And I think the leadership on that does come from South Africa, and it's called the Hague Group, HAGUE. That's the capital city of the world's courts, International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court. So the alternative to a BRICS formation, where so many of the BRICS countries and their companies are making profits. I mean, Chinese drones help to kill the Palestinians as much as any. South African coal goes to Israel in a very hypocritical way. So does coal from Russia and oil from Brazil, and India sends arms. I mean, it's India and China privatized the Haifa port to allow them to import more military goods that will kill Palestinians. What this means, though, Mohammed, I think is a crucial for saying, can there be a different approach? And the Hague Group of about 8 countries, including Namibia. Namibia has been very strong in its foreign ministry in reminding the world that it was a victim of genocide. The Nama and Herero by the Germans, 1904 to 1908. And so the Hague Group is a place where defense of international justice is a fascinating new January 31 strategy to put different countries together that aren't in the BRICS, because most of the BRICS won't support. I mean, Vladimir Putin has an arrest warrant, just as does Benjamin Netanyahu from the same International Criminal Court. So it's wonderful to see the Hague Group stand up to defend at least some semblance that we can do something internationally. However, because the African Union itself is so undemocratic and bureaucratized, it's operating in a country, Ethiopia, that has terrible problems, including cutting off the internet when they have protests. I think we're going to have to see a rebuilding of these processes of a genuine Pan-Africanism from youth to Pan-African youth. And I don't know if it's going to fit the same AU model, or you're going to find some potentials for linking together progressive governments, the most important, of course, being Senegal. But they're under lots of pressure. And the pressures here in Southern Africa have made our governments even more brutal, including here in South Africa, where we, about 6 weeks ago, suffered a major massacre of mine workers called Stilfontein Zama-Zamas, which were the underground mine workers working informally, and the government shut off all the exits, and over 100 starved to death. That was the sort of, let's say, the brutality that now comes with even a South African government that can go to the International Court of Justice and say Israel's committing a genocide. We should stop that. So the contradictions are extreme. And I think it will be up to the youth to be able to call out where there's hypocrisy from South Africa and from their own governments, and to get the space, often through protest, often through clear advocacy and lobbying, sometimes through sanctions movements, but it has to come from below and not through some national endowment for democracy color revolution. Luckily, the National Endowment for Democracy is no longer a factor. It's been closed down. But you see the point that these organic struggles of ordinary people have to start cohering together. And in a place like South Africa today, that's happening as we see people from all walks of life demanding that the budget be redone fairly. I hope South Africa can provide the example that we did from about 50 years ago, where the youth rose up in 1975 and especially in 1976. And they rose up in Soweto, and they rose up to say to their parents, get out of our way, we're protesting the government. Thousands were shot dead around June 16, 1976, but that Soweto uprising was the sort of spark. And it went with the youth of Mozambique and Angola kicking out the Portuguese colonialists. It went with the youth of Zimbabwe kicking out the white Rhodesian regime. And that spirit, I think we can look at again. The most recent contagion was the so-called North African uprising, the Arab Spring. And in that sense, we saw an exceptionally good moment to get new governments into Tunisia and into Egypt. Unfortunately, with Libya, it was just a chaos. Unfortunately, in Egypt, the U.S. had a counter-revolution and overthrew a democratically elected Muslim government. And then in Tunisia, they fell back under the thumb of the IMF. So these are the sorts of bigger problems that require strong ideology. And I recommend to all your listeners and all your wonderful viewers, Frantz Fanon, Walter Rodney, Samir Amin, some of the greatest thinkers of the last 50 years, whose lessons about getting caught in a world economy, whether it's from Washington and New York and London and Paris and Berlin, Frankfurt, Brussels, Tokyo, or getting caught in Johannesburg and Beijing and Shanghai and Moscow, St. Petersburg and Sao Paulo and Rio, Brasilia and Mumbai and Delhi. Those new capitals of power in the BRICS really won't do us any use unless we can break something much bigger, which is a world economy and world society and world environment that can finally be sustainable, meeting the needs of our people and saving the planet. The youth of Africa are going to have to take up that baton.
Do you think that the AU Vision 63 is achievable? And what can you, as well as what can you tell us about the South African, the political tension between US and South Africa in recent times?
It's a great question because in 2013, the 50-year plan of the AU, the Vision 2063, was managed by a South African who was the chair of the AU Commission, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. And she, I thought, did a good job, but within constraints, which were still basically shaped by globalization of the West. And the same was true for another project from South Africa by the then president, Thabo Mbeki, where he brought in Olusegun Obasanjo from Nigeria, Abdulaziz Bouteflika from Algeria, and I think there was one other from, is Abdoulaye Wade from Senegal, but they failed with the New Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD. It was basically, again, a sort of visionary statement, but one excessively oriented to globalization, Africa producing more, becoming more productive within the confines of exporting, mostly to the West at that time and more recently to the BRICS. It just doesn't work if you continue to suffer unequal ecological exchange. And that brings us to whether South Africa can break through. I think we have three choices in dealing with the US. Number one, just succumb and offer to play golf, as Ramaphosa does. Number two, stand up alone, which some countries are doing, and they're succeeding. Mexico and Canada are standing up. Europe is beginning to stand up. China stands up. But really, third option, we need to do this collectively. We need Africa to stand up against Donald Trump and not be bribed. Let me leave it there because we'll see if we can get unity in the world against Donald Trump as the first step to a much better world.
This brings us to the end of today's edition of Our Popular Opinion with Professor Patrick Bond. Thank you very much for being here today. It's been an absolute honor for us to have you on the segment. And before we take a leave of our guests, I encourage you to please be a supporter of this channel by subscribing, like, comment, share, as well as recommend this podcast to your friends and family members. Thank you very much and have a pleasant day.